Okay, so the second person I wanted to introduce you is to Ms. Jennifer Barclay. She has more than 28 years experience in advanced meteorological studies and atmospheric dispersion modeling. She was considered the odour expert of the atmospheric group studies, developers of CalPOF. So unfortunately, she's representing Australia and New Zealand. Unfortunately, she couldn't come here because of the coronavirus situation. So for her keynote speech, we have a video recording that she did. So if you could put it. She's going to speak about the situation on odour management in Australia and New Zealand.
Hello and good morning to you all. Thank you for inviting me to present at the IWA 9th odour conference. I'm really sad that I cannot be here in person, but unfortunately we're still in lockdown level 3, and although I could fly to Bilbao, I would need to spend 2 weeks in managed isolation at my own expense on my return. So I hope that you do not mind this recorded presentation, and I hope that you all have a wonderful IWA conference. Now, Australia and New Zealand have very tight regulated odour control. Traditionally, they have always been based on dispersion modelling, and they also differ widely according to state and country. Note that the odour impact criteria range between 2 to 7, as determined by population density in New South Wales, which is the Sydney area, ACT, and South Australia. In New Zealand, it ranges between 1 and 10, odour units, which is determined by the sensitivity of the land use. In Tasmania, it's fixed at 2 odour units. Now, the averaging time ranges between a second for New South Wales, 3 minutes for ACT in South Australia, and an hour for Queensland and New Zealand. As far as peak to mean ratio goes, both New South Wales and Queensland have user-applied peak to mean ratio, and in Tasmania and New Zealand, it's already included in the odour impact assessment. Now, odour is assessed at the nearest off-site sensitive receptor in New South Wales, Queensland, ACT, and South Australia, and it is assessed at the plant boundary in both Tasmania and New Zealand. So just a point about that, assessing odour at the impact criteria of 1 or 2 odour units is much, much more restrictive than at the nearest sensitive receptor, which could be 400 metres away. Now, Western Australia and more recently Victoria have largely shrugged off the all or nothing approach of only dispersion modelling. They are tired of seeing multiple dispersion model assessments which give completely different answers. They want a much more holistic approach to odour evaluation and assessments. They still recommend dispersion modelling in a level 3 assessment, but want it to be a comparative exercise, such as comparing different emission scenarios. Using meteorological modelling to understand dispersion patterns and to use the model combined with field inspections to verify model output, as well as computing emission rates through reverse dispersion modelling. These states have correctly identified that odour issues require multiple independent lines of evidence that support one another, such as empirical equations, field inspections, comparisons to similar sites, analysis of complaints, and community involvement. But the value of dispersion modelling is not going to go away. Models are getting better and more sophisticated as computational power increases, and they are the only tool that can predict quantitative odour impacts at many points over a wide geographical area. Receptors are inexpensive, they're not restricted to a few measuring points. You can look at, for planning studies, site selection for new facilities, optimizing source layout and designing buffer zones, and optimizing monitoring networks. But odour modelling is not without its challenges. The biggest challenge of all is trying to estimate the instantaneous odour concentration, which can occur on the order of seconds and be the main driver of an offensive odour. This plot, broken into 3 sections, A top, B middle, and C bottom, shows typically what a model will produce using a mean 1-hour odour emission rate. Here, the 1-hour average concentration is less than 1 odour unit and is essentially below the detection threshold. If you, however, consider a 10-minute average concentration, you can see there is a little variability. But when you consider the 12-second average concentrations, you can clearly see that the concentration is now well above the detection threshold of 1 and is variable in the range of 1 to 6 odour units. Now, in order to try and account for the intravariability, we typically use peak to mean factors, i.e. we increase the 1-hour concentration output by multiplying the concentration by a constant peak factor to try and describe the instantaneous odour value. The peak to mean factors are either constant or they vary by source type or by source and atmospheric stability, as well as being near or far field. This plot shows 3 odour concentration profiles measured at 50 meters, red line, 100 meters, blue line, and 150 meters, green line. The odour concentration was measured for 5 minutes, roughly 300 seconds, at each point downwind. The wind was 2 meters per second with neutral atmospheric conditions from an odour control stack of approximately 12 meters. What is clear from these odour concentration profiles is that at 50 meters, the fluctuations in odour concentration are significant compared to that at 100 meters and at 150 meters, where it's less than 1 odour unit. What this means is that the peak to mean factor should be high close to the source, which will depend on atmospheric stability, wind speed, and source characteristics, and then decrease significantly with downward distance, such that it is close or near to 1 at 100 meters downwind. This slide shows the New South Wales peak to mean factors. Note that the peak to mean factors vary according to source type, Pascal-Gifford class, and whether they are near or far field. One other thing to point out here is that the New South Wales regulations makes a distinction between whether a source is wake-free or wake-affected. This has to do whether the source meets the good engineering practice stack formula height or not. Formula height is defined as the structure height plus 1.5 times the lesser of the width or height of the structure itself. If the stack is taller than the formula height, then it is considered wake-free, and the peak to mean factor is generally higher than when the stack is wake-affected. The reason for this is that the structure, if perceived to be in the way, will remove mass from the plume, cause the plume height to be lower, and promote dispersion and dilution, so that ultimately it's lower, the concentration is lower downwind. These are the Queensland peak to mean factors. Note they are more simple than the New South Wales ones. They are constant for all stability classes and for all downward distances. They only differ according to source type, and like New South Wales, they also distinguish between whether a stack is wake-free or wake-affected. A bit more on the GEP formula height. For a stack 1 meter either side of the formula height means, according to the rulings, that different peak to mean factors are applied. For example, if the GEP formula height is 25 meters, a stack just under 25 meters or 25 meters is considered wake affected and means that a peak to mean factor of 2 in Queensland is applied and 2.3 in New South Wales. However, while a stack just above GEP formula height, say at 26 meters, which is now considered wake-free, must apply a peak to mean factor of 10 in Queensland and 25 in New South Wales. This is what the New South Wales peak to mean factors look like with distance downwind. The top 2 lines, red and orange, represents a wake-free point source of 26 meters high for stable and unstable conditions, while the bottom blue line represents a wake-affected point source for all stabilities and is just a 25 meter high stack. These curves have been adjusted for the near and the far field, assuming that the far field is 10 times the largest dimension of the structure. However, because of the time-consuming nature in computing two different sets of receptor grids for the near and far field, usually only the near field peak-to-mean factor is applied to all downward distances in New South Wales. Now I'm going to argue that peak-to-mean factors determined by GEP formula height are fundamentally incorrect for several reasons. Firstly, most, if not all, odour control unit stacks and other point sources in odour industrial sites are likely to always be well-mixed plumes and are essentially all wake-affected. These sources are located on industrial sites with multiple short and tall structures and trees. Further, they have little buoyancy as they're mostly emitting at ambient temperature and have weak to moderate momentum. The minute the plume is released from these generally short stacks, they are subject to significant vertical and horizontal wind shear and turbulent mixing from all nearby structures and vegetation. So fundamentally, the New South Wales and Queensland peak-to-mean factors that depend on GEP formula height are incorrect. The stack cannot go from being wake-affected to non-wake-affected 1 metre either side of the formula height. Further, we know that stacks higher than formula height can still be wake-affected, and this is part of the reason why the US EPA recently modified subroutine wake flag and air mod to force all stacks to be wake-affected if they fell between formula height and less than 65 metres. Note that we did not do this in CalPUF, not because we don't agree, but because these equations were developed on stacks less than formula height only. The current set of peak-to-mean factors in New South Wales and Queensland underpredict in the near field and overpredict in the far field being more than 100 metres. They also produce a significant discontinuity from the near field to the far field, and they run the risk of swamping the effects of the meteorology. So where to from here? This plot shows what the peak-to-mean factors should look like. The New South Wales current factors are also shown as dotted lines. Very unstable conditions should have a much higher peak-to-mean factor close to the source than very stable atmospheric conditions with neutral and weakly stable and unstable somewhere in the middle. The profiles will change somewhat depending on the wind speed, but the peak-to-mean factors will basically always be higher close to the source under unstable conditions than stable. Note how the peak-to-mean factor returns to around 1 around 100 metre and stays at 1 at all downwind distances thereafter. These peak-to-mean factors can be derived for individual sites. Put into practice, this is the difference it makes. The top figure shows a wastewater treatment boundary as the blue dotted line. The odour impact criteria here is 2 odour units, which is shown by the orange line. The green line demarcates everything greater than 2, and the yellow line everything below 2. Using the New South Wales peak-to-mean factors for a wake-affected stack at 24 metres, there are no exceedances beyond the plant boundary of 2. Note how the orange 2 odour unit line is within the plant boundary. Now, for a stack 1 metre higher at 25 metres, now considered a wake-free stack, the orange line in the middle figure shows significant exceedance of the 2 odour unit isoplith lying to the south and west of the facility. Now, using site-specific peak-to-mean factors, the 2 odour unit curve has shrunk significantly and now only covers a small area to the south and west of the facility. So this is my last slide. What is the future and where will we be going in New Zealand and Australia? I think we'll begin to see much more use of sonic anemometers, which are already being routinely rolled out around both countries. These instruments are vastly more sophisticated than regular cup and vein anemometers. They are able to routinely measure turbulence, calms, can self-calibrate, and can measure at a very high temporal frequency. These instruments can be used to develop site-specific peak-to-mean factors. I also believe we're going to see much more empirical equations in the livestock industry. These equations are usually developed locally and hold regulatory status. Their computation of odour exposure is similar to that of dispersion models, and their results can be determined through comparisons with relevant odour impact criteria. Those empirical equations that include the frequency of wind direction distribution over a full year will provide much more valuable than those that don't. I believe we will continue to see states in Australia and New Zealand move away from dispersion model only results to a more holistic, multi-pronged assessments. And models themselves will continue to grow and advance. They are no longer held back by computational power and efficiency. There's going to be movement towards second-order closure models, especially in the advanced Lagrangian puff and particle models. These models will actually model the turbulence and will be able to provide odour concentration fluctuations, alleviating the need for constant peak-to-mean factors. However, both Australia and New Zealand are armed to the teeth with odour regulations. Sometimes this is not a good thing, as change can be very slow. Thank you for your time, everyone.